He laughed. That was the part Evelyn Hartwell could never explain to people afterward. Not the way he looked at her, not the words he said, but the sound of his laughter. Thomas Greaves stood at the altar of the only church in Red Willow Creek, took one long look at the woman walking toward him, and laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not the kind a man makes when he doesn't know what else to do. A real laugh, loud, shoulders shaking, like she was the funniest thing he'd seen all year. The pews went quiet for exactly 1 second. Then the room followed him. Evelyn stopped walking. Her foot was mid-step, her hand gripping the small bundle of dried wildflowers someone had pressed into her palm that morning. She stood there in the middle of that aisle while the sound bounced off the wooden walls around her, and she did not cry. She was too stunned to cry. She just stood and took it, the way she had been taking things her whole life. If this moment feels unbearable to witness, imagine living it. Imagine being her. This is the story of a woman the world decided wasn't worth keeping, and the day everything changed. Don't go anywhere. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next, because this story is only getting started. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me. Because she didn't fall. Not yet. And what happens in the next 2 hours will change the way you think about courage, about loneliness, and about the kind of love that nobody sees coming. The morning of her wedding, Evelyn Hartwell burned the eggs. She didn't mean to. She had been up since before the sun, moving quietly through the small back kitchen of her family's house, trying not to wake anyone, trying to have a few minutes alone before the day started and became something she couldn't control. She'd cracked 4 eggs into the iron skillet, gotten distracted staring at the window. At nothing, really, just the flat gray sky and the cottonwood tree that had been losing branches since before she was born. And by the time she smelled the smoke, the edges were black. She ate them anyway. Scraped the pan, sat at the table alone, and ate them without butter or salt because she didn't want to be the kind of woman who wasted food on a morning like this. That was how Evelyn Hartwell had always survived things. She ate the burned part. She made do. She told herself it wasn't so bad, and then she believed it well enough to get through the next hour, and then the hour after that. She was 24 years old. She had a face that people called plain when they were being kind, and something worse when they weren't. She had brown hair she kept pinned back so tight it gave her headaches, and hands that were rougher than any woman in Red Willow Creeks would admit to having, because Evelyn had been doing housework since she was 7, and nobody had ever suggested she stop. She was not stupid. She knew that privately, even when no one around her seemed to agree. She had read every book in the small traveling library that came through town twice a year. She had done the family's accounts since her father's eyesight started failing. She could skin a rabbit faster than her brother, and she never once got credit for it. What she was, in the eyes of her family in this town, was difficult to place. Too old to be charming. Too quiet to be interesting. Too stubborn, her mother said, meaning that Evelyn had opinions and the misfortune of sometimes letting them show. The marriage to Thomas Greaves had been her mother's arrangement. That was the honest truth of it, though the way Ruth Hartwell told it, you'd think she had engineered a diplomatic treaty rather than negotiated a transaction involving her own daughter. Thomas was 29, recently widowed, owned a decent plot of land east of town, and had expressed interest, loosely, conditionally, the way a man might express interest in a horse before getting a closer look, and taking a wife. He's not asking for much, Ruth had told Evelyn, which was her mother's way of saying Evelyn shouldn't expect much either. You're not in a position to hold out, Evie. I'm telling you that plainly because I love you. Evelyn had not said what she was thinking. She almost never did. She nodded, and she agreed, and 2 weeks later she was standing in her late grandmother's dress being told she looked fine. Not pretty, just fine. And her brother Calvin was already irritated about having to miss a morning of work for the ceremony. She told herself it would be all right. She had been telling herself that her entire life, and so far, it had been just enough to keep her upright. The church in Red Willow Creek was not much of a church. It was a building with a cross nailed above the door and wooden pews that creaked like old bones every time someone shifted weight. The minister, Reverend Albrecht, was a thin, nervous man who smelled of pipe tobacco and always spoke too fast, as if he was worried someone would stop him before he finished. He was already at the front when Evelyn arrived, shuffling papers, not looking at anyone. There were about 40 people in those pews. Red Willow Creek was not a large town, but a wedding was a reason to come out, especially midweek when there wasn't much else happening. People came for the spectacle. They came to see who married whom and draw their conclusions and have something to talk about over supper. Evelyn walked in from the side door with her mother's hand at her elbow, the grip firm and a little too tight, the way Ruth Hartwell held on to things she wasn't sure about. The murmuring in the pews quieted to a low hum. Evelyn kept her eyes ahead. She did not look at the faces on either side because she already knew what she would find there, the mild curiosity of people who were here not for her, but for the event of it. Thomas Greaves was standing at the altar. He was a broad man, solid in the shoulders, with the kind of square jaw that made people in this country take a man seriously before he'd said a word. He had dark hair he'd oiled back for the occasion and a vest that had been recently pressed. He looked, objectively, like a man who could afford to be selective. Evelyn noticed that immediately, the way you notice things when you are bracing for them. She started down the aisle. She made it about 10 steps before Thomas Greaves got a full, unobstructed look at her face. The laugh came before he could have stopped it, even if he'd wanted to, and from what followed, it was clear he did not want to stop it. It burst out of him, sudden and genuine, the kind of laugh that comes from a man who isn't used to hiding what he finds funny. He actually turned sideways to say something to his friend standing near the front pew, and the friend, a heavy-set man named Doyle, who worked at the feed store, started smiling too, that terrible complicit smile of men who find cruelty entertaining. Evelyn stopped. The pews took about 2 seconds to process what was happening, and then the silence cracked. Not everyone laughed. She needed to remember that afterward, even if she couldn't in the moment, but enough people did. Enough people at least smiled or looked away too fast, or did that thing where they find something suddenly very interesting to study on the floor. The minister cleared his throat. Her mother's grip on her elbow disappeared. Thomas Greaves composed himself enough to look at Reverend Albrecht. "I'm sorry," he said, not sounding sorry. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Ruth Hartwell said from behind Evelyn. Her voice was sharp, controlled. "The arrangement was agreed upon." "The arrangement," Thomas said slowly, "was based on certain representations that don't appear to match the, He gestured vaguely in Evelyn's direction, the way a man might gesture at a piece of furniture that hadn't been what he ordered. The reality of the situation. Evelyn stood in the middle of the aisle and said nothing. She was not going to cry. She had decided that during the walk from the door, somewhere in the 2 seconds between hearing the laugh and understanding what it meant, she was not going to give Thomas Greaves or this town or her mother or anyone else in this building the satisfaction of watching her break down in a church. She had too much of whatever her mother called stubbornness, and what Evelyn privately thought of as the only thing she actually owned. "If you have something to say to me," Evelyn said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect, "say it to me." Thomas looked at her with an expression that was almost admiration, except it wasn't. It was the look of a man who has found an obstacle mildly more interesting than expected. "All right," he said. "You're not what I was told. I'm not going to stand up here and pretend otherwise." "What were you told?" "That you were suitable." He said the word with a small shrug, like that covered everything. "And I'm not." "In my opinion, no." The silence in the church was now a different kind of silence. It had weight to it. Evelyn was aware of 40 pairs of eyes on her back, and she was aware that every one of those people was waiting to see what she would do. She could feel her mother behind her, not moving, not speaking, already calculating how to retell this story in a way that minimized her own role in it. Evelyn took a breath. She did not leave. She did not collapse. She stood where she was, in her dead grandmother's dress, holding dried wildflowers. And she faced the man who had just publicly declared her inadequate, and she did not look away from him. Later, people would talk about that. Not immediately. Immediately they were too caught up in the spectacle. But later, some of them would mention it. She didn't run. She just stood there. It did not feel like courage from the inside. It felt like the only option, because her legs weren't quite working and she didn't know what she would do if she moved. Reverend Albrecht was making distressed noises. Ruth Hartwell had stepped up beside Evelyn and was saying something in a low, pressurized voice to Thomas, arguing the terms of something, making it worse. Calvin was nowhere she could see. Thomas's friend Doyle was grinning at the floor. A woman in the third pew, Mrs. Hart, who ran the dry goods store and knew everything about everyone. was whispering behind her hand to the woman next to her. Evelyn stood in the middle of it and felt, with a clarity that surprised her, completely alone. Not the ordinary lonely that had been with her most of her life, the background hum of it, the manageable kind. This was something else. This was the specific loneliness of being surrounded by people and understood by none of them. She was thinking, oddly, about the burned eggs, about eating them alone at the kitchen table in the gray morning light before anyone was awake, about how that had been the best part of this day, those few quiet minutes with no one looking at her, no one deciding anything about her. She thought, I should have stayed there. I should have stayed in that kitchen and not come here. I'll marry her. The voice came from the back. It was not loud exactly, but it was clear, and the church was quiet enough that it carried. Evelyn turned, everyone turned, toward the rear pews. The man standing there was not someone she recognized immediately, though she'd probably seen him around town. He was tall, not dramatically so, but he had the kind of build that made a room feel slightly smaller when he walked in. Dark hair, a few days past needing a cut. A weathered face, the kind that came from working outdoors in all seasons, with a jaw that had some old scar running along it that he'd clearly stopped thinking about years ago. He was wearing practical clothes, nothing pressed, nothing meant to impress anyone. His hat was in his hands. He said it again, quieter, to the room more than to anyone specifically. I'll marry her. The silence that followed was a different kind entirely. It was the silence of a room trying to determine if it had heard correctly. Thomas Greaves turned around fully. Wilder, he said, and there was something in his voice, not quite respect, but the particular edge men get when they're aware they're talking to someone they can't entirely dismiss. Thomas, the man said back. He looked at Evelyn then, not at her face the way Thomas had looked at her. Not cataloging, not measuring, just a direct level look, like he was waiting to see what she would do. Caleb Wilder. She placed the name after a second. He ran the ranch east of the Dennett property, the one that backed up against the creek line. She'd heard her father mention him once or twice. Something about water rights, something about being stubborn with a fence line. She didn't know him. She had never spoken to him. I was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. You can't be serious, Ruth Hartwell said. She sounded genuinely baffled, which was unusual for a woman who prided herself on not being baffled by anything. I'm generally pretty serious, Caleb said. You don't even know her. He doesn't either, Caleb said, and tilted his head slightly toward Thomas. And that didn't seem to stop anyone from making arrangements. Thomas made a short sound, not quite a laugh, something more defensive than that. You want to explain what you're doing? Not particularly. Reverend Albrecht had found his voice again somewhere during all of this, and was now saying that if both parties were willing and of sound mind, the ceremony could proceed, though in his experience it was typically better when Evelyn, Caleb said her name. Not loudly, not with anything attached to it, no softness, no command. Just her name, like he was checking if she could hear him. She looked at him across the length of that church and tried to figure out what was happening and couldn't. You don't have to, he said. If you'd rather just leave, I'll walk out with you. Nobody has to do anything. She stared at him. Why would you do either of those things? Because somebody should. That was all he said. He didn't explain further. He didn't offer credentials or justifications or a list of his better qualities. He stood at the back of the church with his hat in his hands and waited. Evelyn looked at her mother, who was watching this exchange with an expression caught somewhere between calculation and alarm. She looked at Thomas Greaves, who had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable now, though she doubted it would last. She looked at the 40 people in those pews, the ones who had laughed, the ones who had looked away, the ones who were watching this with their mouths not quite closed because they were still catching up to what was happening. She turned back to Caleb Wilder. You don't know anything about me, she said. That's true, he said. I could have all kinds of problems. You have no idea. Also true. You're a stranger. You're not wrong. Evelyn pressed her lips together. She was aware that this conversation had an audience, that every word was being cataloged and would be repeated for weeks in this town, that whatever she said next would follow her. She was also aware, and this was the strange part, the part that she would think about for a long time afterward, that she was not afraid of the man at the back of the church. She had been afraid of Thomas Greaves, or not afraid exactly, but braced, The way you brace for something you already know is going to hurt. She was not braced for this. She did not know what she was for this. All right, she said. She heard her mother exhale. She heard Thomas mutter something to Doyle. She heard the collective shift of 40 people in creaking pews, readjusting their understanding of what this morning was going to be. Caleb Wilder walked up the aisle. He walked past Thomas Greaves without looking at him, past the third pew and Mrs. Hart and all her whispers, past Evelyn's brother Calvin, who had apparently appeared from somewhere near the side wall, and he stopped beside Evelyn and held out his arm. Not his hand. His arm. The way you offer an arm to someone on unsteady ground. She took it. She didn't know why. She took it because it was there and because her legs still weren't entirely reliable, and because something in the practical mechanics of the gesture, not a statement, not a performance, just an arm, here, take it, was the first thing that morning that had made any kind of sense. They stood in front of Reverend Albrecht. Thomas and his friend had moved to a pew, which was a surreal thing to witness, the rejected groom taking a seat to watch the wedding proceed with a different man. Ruth Hartwell had moved to the other side and was composing herself with great effort. Calvin looked like he wished he were anywhere else on earth. Reverend Albrecht, to his credit, recovered his professional bearing and began the ceremony. It was short. It was not beautiful. Nobody cried, or if they did, it was from confusion. Evelyn said the words she was asked to say and tried to focus on the minister's voice and not on the awareness of the man standing beside her, solid and quiet, and not on the fact that 20 minutes ago she had been eating burned eggs at a kitchen table, and now she was apparently getting married to someone whose last name she had only just confirmed. When it was over, Reverend Albrecht pronounced them married and looked deeply relieved to have arrived at the end of the ceremony. Caleb Wilder turned to her. He did not look triumphant. He did not look like a man who had just done something noble and expected recognition for it. He looked, if anything, like a man who had made a practical decision and was now ready to move on to the next thing. "I've got a wagon outside," he said, "whenever you're ready." She almost laughed. It came up suddenly, somewhere beneath the numbness, the absurdity of it. A wagon, whenever you're ready, as if they'd been running an errand and it was time to head home. "I don't have any of my things," she said. "Tell me what you need. I'll go back for it, or we'll send someone." "I need—" She stopped. She thought about her room in her family's house, the small collection of it, a few dresses, the books, the accounts ledger she'd kept for her father, which was probably his to keep anyway. "I need the books," she said. "There are 6 of them. They're on the shelf above the washstand." Something shifted in his expression, just slightly. "I'll have someone fetch them," he said. They walked out of the church together, through the doors and into the flat morning light of Red Willow Creek, and the town watched them go. Evelyn did not look back. Her hands were shaking, she noticed. She had not noticed that until just now, outside in the air, where no one was watching as closely. She pressed them against the skirt of her grandmother's dress and kept walking. She did not know this man. She did not know where she was going. She did not know what came next, or what the arrangement meant, or what he expected of her, or if she had made the worst decision of her life in there, or the only sensible one. She knew that she was not in that church anymore. She knew that Thomas Greaves's laugh was behind her, getting smaller. She knew that her hands were shaking, and that the man walking beside her either hadn't noticed or was choosing not to say anything, and that both possibilities felt, for different reasons, like a kind of grace she hadn't been expecting today. The wagon was where he said it would be, hitched to a plain brown horse with a patient expression and a swished tail. Caleb helped her up with a hand that was dry and matter-of-fact, and then walked around to the other side and climbed up himself. "It's about 2 hours' ride," he said. "All right," she said. He clicked his tongue at the horse, and the wagon moved, and Red Willow Creek began to fall away behind them. Evelyn Hartwell. Evelyn Wilder, now, though the name would take time to feel like anything, sat in the wagon seat with her hands folded in her lap, and her grandmother's dress catching the morning dust, and the dried wildflowers she was still somehow holding pressed flat against her knee, and she breathed. In and out. Just that. For now, just that. The road stretched out ahead of them, long and pale and without markers, the kind of road that doesn't promise anything, the kind of road that just goes. She had no idea where it ended. She had no idea what waited for her when they got there. She had come to this morning expecting a life she didn't want and walked out of it with something she couldn't name, in the company of a stranger who had offered her his arm and said somebody should. She wasn't sure yet if that was enough. She wasn't sure yet if she was relieved or terrified. She thought, sitting in that wagon in the morning dust, that she had probably been both of those things her whole life without ever having a reason quite this specific. The horse walked on. Caleb Wilder said nothing. And Evelyn, for the first time in longer than she could easily calculate, did not feel the particular weight of being watched. The ranch did not look like much from the road. Evelyn had not been expecting much. She had adjusted her expectations downward so many times in her life that the mechanism was nearly automatic. But even so, the first sight of it caught her somewhere between relief and something harder to name. It was not a ruin. It was not prosperous either. It was a place that had clearly been worked hard and was currently being worked hard still, but by not quite enough hands, the way you can tell when a field has been managed by one person doing the job of three. The fences were mended but rough. The barn was standing and solid, but the door had a lean to it that suggested the hinges had been replaced at least once with whatever was available. The house itself was low and wide, built from timber that had gone silver gray with weather, with a porch that ran along the front and held a single wooden chair and nothing else. She looked at it for a moment from the wagon seat before Caleb climbed down. "It's not finished," he said without apology. "The east room needs a wall replastered. I've been doing it in sections." "How long have you been doing it in sections?" A pause. "About 2 years." She didn't say anything to that. She climbed down from the wagon herself before he could come around to help her, which was a habit more than a statement. She'd been getting herself in and out of things her whole life without assistance, and the muscle memory of it was hard to override. Her grandmother's dress caught on the wheel, and she heard the fabric tear slightly at the hem, and she pressed her lips together and kept moving. Inside, the house was cleaner than she'd expected. Not clean in the way of a woman's hand, clean in the way of a man who had no interest in clutter, and had simply removed everything that served no function. There was a table with 2 chairs, a wood stove that had been recently blacked, a shelf with canned goods organized by size, which was either efficiency or something close to loneliness made visible, a braided rug on the floor that had worn thin at the center from years of feet crossing it in the same path. Caleb showed her the room at the back of the house, the one that wasn't his. It had a bed with a quilt that smelled of cedar, a small dresser with a water basin, and the window that looked out at the cottonwood line along the creek. "There's a latch on the inside," he said, pointing to the door. She looked at him. "I'm saying you can use it," he said. "If you want. I'm not—" He stopped, seemed to choose his next words with some care. "I don't expect anything from you. I want to say that plainly so we don't have to keep dancing around it." Evelyn had been waiting for the condition. There was always a condition. She had lived 24 years learning to find it, preparing for it, absorbing it when it arrived. She stood in the doorway of this small room and waited for Caleb Wilder to tell her what she owed him. He didn't. "There's water in the pitcher," he said. "I'll start supper. You rest if you need to." He left her there. She heard his boots on the floorboards going back toward the main room, heard the particular sound of the wood stove being opened, the soft iron knock of it. She stood in the room he'd given her and looked at the latch on the inside of the door and felt something she couldn't immediately identify, something that sat in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending out rings she couldn't see the edges of yet. She did not rest. She sat on the edge of the bed for approximately 4 minutes, and then she got up, smoothed the dress she was still somehow wearing, and went to find out what needed doing. The first week was the strangest of her life, and her life had contained some genuinely strange weeks. There was no declared structure to it, no rules handed down, no list of duties and expectations the way she had anticipated, the way her mother would have operated, itemized and clear, so that failure was easy to identify and harder to argue with. Caleb simply worked, and Evelyn, not knowing what else to do with herself, worked alongside him, and slowly, through observation and the asking of specific practical questions, she began to understand the shape of the place. The ranch ran cattle, 43 head at current count, with grazing land that stretched further east toward the creek, and then butted up against a fence line that had been in some kind of quiet dispute with the neighboring property for what sounded like several years. Caleb had 2 horses besides the brown wagon horse, a roan mare named Peg, who was sensible and good-natured, and a black gelding called nothing in particular because Caleb did not seem to believe in naming animals he wasn't sure he'd keep. There were chickens. This was where Evelyn started, because chickens she understood, and because the enclosure needed restrung wire along the south side that she could see from 30 feet away was about to give. The wire on the south pen is going, she said to Caleb on the second morning. He looked up from the harness he was mending on the porch rail. I know. You have spare wire? In the barn, back left corner. She found it. She restrung the south side of the chicken pen herself, with a pair of pliers that had a broken grip. She taped with a strip of leather she found in the same barn corner, and it took her most of the morning and cost her a cut along her left thumb that bled more than it had any right to. She pressed it against her work skirt. She had changed out of the dress on the first morning, having found a pair of the ranch's old work clothes folded in the barn that fit her approximately, and kept going. When she came back to the house for water, Caleb was there, and he looked at her hand. Let me see that. It's fine. It's bleeding through your skirt. I'm aware. He crossed the room and took her hand before she could object, which she was about to, and looked at the cut with the same practical focus he seemed to apply to everything. He cleaned it with something from a tin in the kitchen cabinet that burned sharply, which she did not react to, and wrapped it with a strip of clean cloth. He did all of this without a word, without the kind of commentary that would have come from her family. How did you manage to do that? What were you thinking? Honestly, Evelyn. Just the clean and the wrap and then releasing her hand. The pliers need a new grip, she said. I know that too. You have a lot of things you know about and haven't fixed. He looked at her. It was not a sharp look, not defensive, just a level look, and then he said, I've been working short-handed. She had nothing to say to that. She went back outside. What? Evelyn learned the shape of Caleb Wilder slowly, the way you learn the layout of a house in the dark, by moving through it carefully, noting what was solid and what shifted, where the floor gave and where it held. She had expected a man who would turn out to be performing some version of himself for the first few days and then revert. In her experience, people did that. They showed you the presentable version, and then the walls came down and there was the actual person underneath, usually with sharper edges and more needs than they'd initially let on. Caleb did not perform. That was the thing that kept catching her off guard. He was the same in the morning when he was tired and hadn't spoken yet as he was in the evening. He was the same when a fence post broke and he had to redo 3 hours of work as he was when a task went cleanly. He had moods, she could tell that. He went quiet sometimes in a particular way that was different from his regular quiet, a heavier kind. And on those days she simply worked near him and didn't push, the same way she would have managed any difficult terrain. He was not an easy man to talk to. Not because he was unkind, but because he had apparently spent so many years in his own company that conversation was not his natural mode. He answered questions directly. He offered information when it was relevant. He did not make small talk, and he did not seem to feel the need to fill silence with noise the way most people did, the way Evelyn had been trained by her family to do, to keep the air occupied so no one had a chance to notice what wasn't being said. She found to her surprise that she didn't mind it. The quiet of the ranch was different from the quiet of her family's house, which had always felt like the quiet before a verdict. Someone deciding something about her, someone about to explain again what she'd done wrong. The quiet here was just quiet, the sound of the land doing what the land did. She was not foolish enough to call it comfortable yet, but it was bearable in a way she hadn't expected, and bearable felt like something worth noting. The books arrived on the 5th day, brought by a boy from town on a borrowed horse. 6 of them, wrapped in paper, as she'd asked. She didn't know how Caleb had arranged it, and she didn't ask. She put them on the window ledge of her room, spines out, and that evening she sat in the single chair on the porch, with the one about the Louisiana territories open on her knee while the last of the light went out of the sky. Caleb came out and stood near the porch rail and looked at the sky in the way he did sometimes, assessing something she couldn't read. What are you reading? He asked. Geography, she said. Rivers, mostly. A pause. Why rivers? Because they go somewhere, and because they don't care about anything on either bank. He looked at her. She looked at the page. That's an interesting reason, he said. You asked. He made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, cut short. He went back inside. Evelyn read 2 more pages and then sat looking at the tree line where the creek ran behind it, dark now, the cottonwoods just shapes against the sky, and felt something she was almost afraid to touch. Not happiness. She wasn't ready to call it that. But something adjacent to peace, which was rarer in her experience and more fragile. and the kind of thing you had to be careful around in case you startled it away. The trouble started in the second week, which was when Evelyn began to understand that the ranch had problems she hadn't been told about. She found the first ledger by accident. She was looking for string in the kitchen drawer and found instead a flat book with accounts written in Caleb's blunt, uneven hand, numbers that didn't balance, debts listed in careful columns, a note in the margin that said feed credit, 60 days, underlined twice. She closed it and put it back and said nothing, because she knew better than to lead with what she'd found in a man's private papers. She noticed other things instead, the way she'd learned to notice things, indirectly, through observation, adding up details until the picture was clear without anyone having to say it. The cattle were thinner than they should have been for the season. The feed in the barn was running lower than the number of animals justified. The repairs she kept finding were not the repairs of a man who was managing all right. They were the repairs of a man who was choosing what to fix and what to leave because he couldn't address everything at once. On the 9th day, she said to him at supper, "How long has the east pasture not been grazed?" Caleb looked up from his plate. "Why?" "Because the grass is wrong. It's growing the way land does when it hasn't had stock on it for a while. But there's nothing wrong with the fence on that side, so the cattle should be able to use it." He set his fork down. Not agitated, just stopped. "About 8 months," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, the particular heavy quiet she'd come to recognize. "Water dispute with the neighbor to the east, the Maddox property. Their manager, fellow named Corbin, claims the creek line on that pasture runs through their land, says I've got no right to use the water access there." "Does he have documentation?" "He has a loud voice and a tendency to show up with 2 other men when he wants to make a point." Evelyn absorbed this. "Do you have your deed?" "I have my deed." "What does it say about the creek?" "It says the creek is mine up to the second willow marker, which puts the water access squarely on my land." "Then what's the dispute?" "The dispute," Caleb said, "is that Corbin moved the marker." She stared at him. "He moved it." "Pulled the old one out and put a new one 15 feet further west. Happened sometime last spring while I was dealing with a sick animal for 2 weeks and not watching the fence line." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She thought about the ledger in the drawer, the 60-day credit note, the thin cattle, the 8 months of unused pasture. She did the arithmetic, the way she'd done her father's account since she was 14, adding up what she wasn't being told against what she could see. "This is why the ranch is struggling," she said. It was not a question. Caleb picked his fork back up. "Among other things. And you haven't done anything about the marker." "I went to the county office. They told me I'd need a surveyor's report, and that would take time and money. I don't—" He stopped. "It takes time," he finished. She looked at him across the table. "Have you written it down?" "Everything. The dates, what you saw, the original position of the marker, anything anyone else might have seen." "Why?" "Because that's where you start," she said. "You write everything down, and then you have something to bring to someone with authority, and then Corbin's loud voice is competing with a record rather than just with your word." Caleb was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not quite surprised, but something close to it, recalibrated. "I'm good with accounts," she said, because she could see him being careful about what to say, and she wanted to spare them both the awkwardness of it. "I've been keeping books since I was a girl. I'm not offering to fix anything. I'm saying I can help document it if you want." A long pause. "All right," he said. That was all. But it was different from the all rights before it. She could feel that, even if she couldn't have said exactly why. She started the documentation that same evening, at the kitchen table, with a clean notebook she found in the dresser drawer. Caleb told her what he remembered, and she wrote it down. Dates, descriptions, the name of the man at the county office he'd spoken to, the specific wording of the boundary in his deed, which he finally went and fetched from a box in his room so she could read it herself. His handwriting, she noticed, was functional, but not easy to read. His sentences, when he wrote, were blunt to the point of missing context. It was the writing of someone who had learned to record things, but not to tell them, which was a different skill. She had always known how to tell them. They sat at that table for 2 hours. Caleb talked and Evelyn wrote, and somewhere in the third half hour she stopped transcribing and started asking questions that made him go back, add detail, clarify the sequence of things. He answered, sometimes impatiently, sometimes with a pause that meant he was looking for the accurate word rather than just the easy one, and she waited and wrote. When it was done, she had 4 pages of notes in her own clean hand, organized chronologically, with the relevant deed language copied at the top and a list of potential witnesses at the bottom. Hands from neighboring properties who had been present for certain conversations about the boundary. Caleb read it over. She watched him read it. "You're fast," he said. "I've been doing it a long time." He set the pages down. He looked at her the way she'd noticed him look at things he was trying to determine the nature of. The careful, practical assessment of it, like she was a fence line he was checking for weaknesses. "Why didn't you tell me you could do this?" he asked. "You didn't ask. People usually—" He stopped. "People usually lead with their good qualities." "My family told me my qualities weren't particularly good," she said. She said it flatly, without self-pity, because that was the only way she'd ever found to say it without it costing her something. "It takes me a while to present evidence to the contrary." He was quiet for a moment. Not the heavy quiet. Something different. "They were wrong," he said. Simple as that. No speech attached. He picked up the notebook and looked at the last page again, and then he set it down and said he was going to check on the animals before dark. And he went out the door, and Evelyn sat at the table in the lamplight and stared at the 4 pages she'd written and tried to decide how she felt about those 3 words. They were wrong. She didn't know, yet, how to hold something like that. She'd had so little practice. The rhythm of days established itself around them like water-finding channels. Not deliberately, not discussed, just settled, the way habits do when 2 people share space long enough without antagonizing each other. Evelyn was up before Caleb and had water heated by the time he came out, not because she was performing domesticity, but because she woke early and found the silence of the first hour useful, and the water needed heating anyway. He handled the horses in the morning, she handled the chickens. They split the cattle work depending on what was needed. She was not a skilled rider. This became apparent on the 10th day when she got on Peg for the first time to help move the cattle, and discovered that there was a significant gap between knowing theoretically how to ride a horse and being able to stay comfortably on one while it did what horses did. Peg was gentle. Evelyn was determined. The combination got her through the morning without falling off, which she counted as a success, even though her thighs would inform her the following morning that she had made a significant number of small errors. Caleb said nothing about her riding that day. The following morning, while she was saddling Peg before he'd come out, she heard the porch door open and his boot steps on the porch, and she braced slightly without meaning to, waiting for the instruction she hadn't asked for. "She goes better if you give her more rein on the left," he said from the rail. "She pulls that direction. Let her, and she'll straighten out." Not a criticism, just information. "All right," Evelyn said. "You held on well yesterday." She looked at him. "You saw me grab the saddle horn when she sidestepped." "Everybody grabs the saddle horn when a horse sidesteps," he said. "Nobody who tells you different is being honest." She turned back to the saddle, and she thought that this was the strangest thing about Caleb Wilder. Not that he was kind exactly, but that he told the truth in a way that happened to also be kind, which was different and rarer, and she kept getting caught off guard by it. She found the photograph on a Tuesday afternoon. She had not been snooping. The wind had come up in the afternoon and lifted a piece of paper from the shelf above the wood stove. She didn't know how it had been sitting there without her noticing it, and she had picked it up automatically, and it was not paper, but a photograph, small and slightly faded, with the edges worn soft. A woman, young, dark-haired, with a full smile and her hands clasped in front of her. There was a child in the photograph too, very small, maybe 2 years old, balanced on the woman's knee with the unfocused look of a child who is not interested in sitting still for photographs. Evelyn set it back on the shelf carefully, face up, the way it had been, and she did not ask about it. But she thought about it through the rest of the afternoon, and through supper, and after. She thought about what she was seeing when she looked at the photograph. Not the woman and child specifically, but the edges of them. The wear on the photograph's border that came from being handled repeatedly. The fact that it was the only personal item in the house that wasn't functional. She thought about what Caleb had said in the church. He understood what it felt like to live with loneliness. She'd registered that at the time, and then set it aside because she'd had too many other things to manage. But now she took it back out and looked at it against the photograph on the shelf and the empty chair at the table, and the second-best quilt on her bed that had clearly been well kept, and she began to understand the shape of the loss she had moved into the house alongside. She did not know what happened. She knew better than to assume. But she carried the knowledge of it with her from that point, carefully, the way you carry something fragile through unsteady terrain. She was gentler in the evenings, in a way she couldn't have named if asked. She simply was. On the 14th day, a man rode up to the ranch while Caleb was out at the far fence. Evelyn was on the porch repairing the leather strap on one of the water buckets. When she heard the horse, and she looked up and saw the rider before he saw her. He was heavy-set, somewhere in his 40s, with the kind of face that had settled into its worst expression over many years and stopped moving. He pulled up at the gate and looked at the house with a proprietary look she recognized immediately. The look of a man who has decided he has rights to a place before he's even finished arriving. "Wilder here?" he called. "He's working," Evelyn said. She kept her hands on the leather strap. The man looked at her with visible assessment, the kind that dismissed what it saw before the process was finished. "You must be the churchwoman." "I'm Mrs. Wilder," Evelyn said. Something shifted in his face, barely. Not respect, more like recalculation. "Tell him Corbin came by," the man said. "Tell him the offer still stands, but it won't stand much longer. He knows what I mean." "What offer?" Evelyn said. Corbin looked at her again, the same dismissive look, but with something added to it now, a kind of testing quality. "The one where he sells me the east pasture at a fair price, and we all move on with our lives." "The east pasture with the creek access?" "That's the one." "The creek access that's on his deed." Corbin smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "That's a question for surveyors and lawyers cost money, which is something Wilder's a little short on right now, from what I can see." His eyes moved across the ranch in a deliberate way, across the patched fence, the mismatched barn door, the general look of a place stretched thin. "You tell him what I said." He turned his horse and rode back to the gate. Evelyn sat on the porch with the leather strap in her hands and watched him go. And she felt something she hadn't felt in a while, something specific and clear, clean-edged and useful. She was angry. Not the helpless kind of angry she'd spent most of her life carrying. The other kind. The kind that knows exactly what it wants to do and starts working on how. She went back inside and opened the notebook. She wrote down everything, the time he arrived, what he said, word for word as she could reconstruct it, and particularly the part about Caleb being short on money, because that told her something about what Corbin knew and how he knew it and who might have been talking. She was still writing when Caleb came back in at dusk. She heard him at the door and said, without looking up, "Corbin came by." The door closed. His boots stopped. What did he want? "To suggest you sell him the east pasture." She looked up. "He also knows you're struggling financially. He knew specifically enough that I think someone in town has been talking." Caleb's jaw set. Not a dramatic expression. He wasn't a dramatic man. But she could see it, the controlled kind of anger that came from someone who'd been patient a long time and was getting closer to the end of it. "He's been waiting me out," Caleb said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "He thinks if he waits long enough, the money situation will make the decision for him. He might not be wrong. He is, though." She turned the notebook toward him so he could see the pages. "Because in 2 weeks you're going to have documentation that an attorney can use. And Corbin is going to find out that the difference between bullying a man who's alone and dealing with a record of his own behavior is significant." Caleb looked at the notebook. He looked at her. "An attorney still costs money," he said. "I know." She had been thinking about this. The east pasture, how many head could it support if you had water access again? He thought. Another 15-20 head. And what would that mean for the feed situation? We'd break even inside of 4 months. Better than that by spring. Then it's worth the attorney cost. Maybe. Definitely, she said. She said it plainly, without argument in it, just the conviction of someone who had done the math and was confident in the number. "We document it correctly. We take it to someone who can file the right complaint, and Corbin finds out his moved marker is a liability, not a strategy." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You keep saying we," he said. Evelyn looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I do." Neither of them said anything else for a moment. The stove was heating the room and outside the wind had come up again, the kind that presaged a weather change. and from the barn she could hear one of the horses moving in its stall, restless with whatever animals knew that people didn't. "I'll look for an attorney in Mill Haven," Caleb said finally. "There's a man there who handled a boundary case for the Dennetts a few years back." "Find out what he charges before you commit to anything," Evelyn said. "I wasn't born yesterday," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm still saying it." He almost smiled. It was small and it was gone quickly, but she caught it, and she looked back down at her notebook and said nothing about it, which she thought was the right call. The weather changed overnight. She woke in the dark to the sound of rain on the roof, hard and purposeful, the kind of rain that meant business, and by morning there was mud from the barn to the gate, and one of the chicken enclosure posts had gone sideways in the softened ground. Caleb was already outside when she got up, in the rain, in a coat that was not keeping him as dry as it should have been, working on the post. She put on the other coat. There were two hanging by the door, his good one and the work one, and she took the work one, and went out to help. He looked at her when she appeared beside him, but did not tell her to go back inside, which she appreciated, and they got the post reset and the wire retied and did it in silence, in the rain, with mud on both of them up to the knee by the time it was done. They came back to the porch and scraped their boots, and she put water on, and he stood at the window looking out at the pasture where the rain was sheeting sideways now. "The creek's going to come up," he said. "How much?" "Enough to check the bank on the east side." "After breakfast," she said. "After breakfast," he agreed. She handed him a cup and he took it, and for a moment they stood there in the kitchen while rain hit the glass. And she was aware of how ordinary this was and how strange that was. How ordinary she felt, for the first time she could remember, in the middle of an ordinary morning, in a life that 3 weeks ago she hadn't known was going to be hers. She did not trust it yet. She was not built for trusting things quickly. But she thought, carefully, not gripping it, the way she'd learned to think about fragile things, that she might be able to, eventually. That maybe ordinary with the right person in it was not something to be afraid of. Maybe it was, in fact, the thing she'd been looking for without ever having a word for it. She drank her coffee and listened to the rain and did not say any of that because she was not ready yet. And also because Caleb Wilder was not a man who needed everything said out loud. And that, she was beginning to understand, was one of the things about him that fit her in a way she hadn't expected anything to. The rain kept coming. The creek would be up by mid-morning. There was work ahead. She finished her cup and went to find her boots. The creek came up 8 inches by mid-morning, which was not catastrophic but was enough to matter. Evelyn followed Caleb out to the east bank after breakfast, both of them in coats that were losing the argument with the rain, and she saw immediately what he'd been worried about. The bank on the far side had eroded over the winter in a way that would eventually redirect the water flow if it wasn't addressed, pulling the creek line further west, further, she noted, toward where Corbin had repositioned the boundary marker. Whether Corbin had thought about that when he moved it, or whether the land was simply doing what land did without caring about anyone's disputes, she couldn't say. But she wrote it down when they got back inside, added it to the notebook under a heading she titled Creek Bank Observation, 3rd week of April, with a description of what she'd seen and a rough sketch of the bank's current edge versus where it had clearly been based on the vegetation line. Caleb watched her draw the sketch from across the table. "You can draw," he said. "It's not art," she said. "It's a diagram." Still, she kept drawing. "My father had me keep records of the property when I was young, fence lines, water sources. He said you never know when you'll need to prove what you had. Smart man. When it suited him." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't push, which was one of the things she was learning to rely on about him. He knew where the edges of things were without being told. She finished the sketch, labeled the relevant features, and added it to the notebook between the account of Corbin's visit and the copy of the deed language. 4 weeks ago, she had not owned a notebook. She had not owned much of anything that could be called entirely hers. Now she had 4 pages of documentation and a diagram that might, if the attorney in Millhaven was competent, be the beginning of something Corbin had not accounted for when he decided Caleb Wilder was a man he could wait out. She closed the notebook and went to see about lunch, and the rain kept coming down outside, steady and without apology. The question of Caleb's past arrived the way most difficult things arrived between them. Not announced, not with ceremony, but through accumulation. She had been carrying the photograph in the back of her mind since the Tuesday she'd found it, setting it alongside the other pieces she'd gathered. The heavy quiet, the second quilt, The way he sometimes stopped at the window in the evenings and looked at nothing for a long moment before coming back to himself. She did not want to pry. She was herself a person who did not enjoy being pried at, and she believed other people deserved the same courtesy. But there was a difference between prying and understanding, and she was beginning to need the second one. It happened on a night in the fourth week when neither of them could sleep. She had come out for water. She genuinely had come out for water, not for conversation, and found him already at the table with a lamp lit and a cup of something that had gone cold. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. Neither of them said anything immediately, which was normal, except that the silence had a different texture at this hour, without the day's work to give it shape. She got her water. She stood at the counter for a moment. She almost went back to her room. "The photograph on the shelf," she said. "I found it a few weeks ago. The wind moved it. I put it back." He looked at his cup. "I'm not asking you to explain it," she said. "I just wanted you to know I'd seen it, so it wasn't something between us that only one of us knew about." A long pause. Outside, an owl somewhere in the cottonwoods was making its one repeated sound, patient and persistent. "Her name was Clara," he said. "My wife. The child was our son, Thomas. I was 14 months old in that photograph." Evelyn waited. "Fever came through the valley in the fall of 1871, he said. "Took them both inside a week of each other. I was out with the cattle when Clara started showing symptoms, and I didn't know until I came back and found—" He stopped. He picked up the cup and set it back down without drinking. "I didn't know until I came back." She didn't say she was sorry. She had noticed that sorry was often what people said when they didn't know what else to say, and it rarely gave the other person anything to hold on to. Instead, she said, "How long ago was that?" 6 years. "And you've been here alone since?" "I've had hands come and go. One fellow stayed 3 seasons, good worker, left when his family came west and needed him elsewhere." He was quiet. "But alone, yes, in the way that matters." Evelyn set her cup down and sat at the table across from him. Not close, just at the table, present. "I've been alone in the way that matters for as long as I can remember," she said. "It's a different kind when you're surrounded by people who should know you and don't. Maybe worse, in some ways. At least yours had a reason." He looked at her then, directly, in the way he rarely did at this hour. "Your family. My mother manages by control. My father manages by absence. My brother is somewhere between the two." She said it the same way she said most things about them. Flat, factual, like reading from the ledger she'd kept all her life of what she'd been given and what she hadn't. "They're not bad people. They just I was never, for them, what they hoped for. And after enough years of that, it stops being a specific thing they do and becomes the air in the room." "You believed them," Caleb said. She looked at him. "You believed them when they told you that you weren't enough," he said. Not as an accusation, just as a thing he'd observed and was naming. She held that for a moment. "Didn't you believe yours? When the valley took them and you stayed?" His jaw shifted. "Yes." "Then we have that in common." The owl outside went quiet. The lamp between them on the table burned without flickering, the way a lamp does when the air is still, and the kitchen held the two of them and what they'd said, and neither of them moved to leave. "I didn't step forward in that church because I'm a good man," Caleb said. It came out like something he'd been holding on to for a while, something that had been accumulating pressure. "I want to be clear about that. I don't want you building something on a wrong foundation." "Then why?" she said. "Because I recognized it." He looked at the table. "Standing there with everyone in the room, making a decision about you. Having the verdict handed down before you'd done anything wrong. I know what that looks like from the inside. I could see it on you from the back of the room." Evelyn was very still. "I'm not asking you to be grateful," he said quickly. "That's not—" "I know it isn't," she said. "I don't need you to feel anything about it." "Caleb." She said his name quietly, and he stopped. "I know," she said. "I know it's not a debt. I know you're not keeping score." She paused. "That's one of the things I couldn't figure out at first. I kept waiting for the condition." "What condition?" "The thing you'd want in return. The thing that would turn out to be the real reason." He was quiet for a moment. "And?" "And there isn't one." She said it almost to herself, like confirming something she'd suspected but hadn't been ready to trust. That took me a while to believe. How long? She thought about it honestly. I'm still working on it, she said, but I'm closer than I was. He nodded, once, not triumphant about it, just received it. They sat there a while longer without talking, and when she finally went back to her room, she lay awake for a time, staring at the ceiling and thinking about what he'd said. He had recognized something in her from the back of her room. He had seen her before she'd said a word, before she'd done anything except walk down an aisle and get publicly humiliated, and he had recognized something worth stepping forward for. She did not know what to do with that. She was going to have to figure it out. The attorney in Mill Haven was named Prescott. He was a small, precise man with a filing system that appeared to make sense only to him, and a habit of repeating the last word of your sentence back to you in a question tone was down, which Evelyn found maddening but productive. They rode to Mill Haven on a clear morning, the week after the rain. She brought the notebook. Caleb brought the deed and the money he had, which was not as much as Prescott's usual fee, but more than Evelyn had expected Caleb to have managed to set aside, given everything. Prescott read the deed. He read her notes. He looked at her diagram of the creek bank and said, "You drew this?" In a tone that was technically neutral, but contained a clear undertone of surprise. "Is it useful?" she asked. "It's very useful," he said. Creek bank migration documentation in combination with the original marker placement, could establish a pattern of interference with natural boundary markers. Natural boundary markers, he wrote, which is a distinct legal category from surveyor's stakes. Meaning, Caleb said, meaning that if we can establish that the creek bank has been moving consistently in a direction that benefits Corbin's position, and tie that to the date the marker was moved, we have the basis for an argument that interference was deliberate rather than a response to natural change. How long? Caleb said. To file? 2 weeks. To get a response? County moves at its own pace. And the cost? Prescott named a number. Caleb said nothing immediately. Evelyn looked at the attorney and said, "What happens if we bring you 2 witnesses who can speak to the original marker placement? Does that change the filing complexity?" Change the filing complexity? Prescott wrote something. "It would strengthen the case substantially." "Then we'll have them," she said. She looked at Caleb. He was looking at her. She looked back at Prescott. "We'll need a week." On the ride back, Caleb said, "Who did you have in mind?" "The Dennett boy. He does their fence work and he rides that boundary regularly. He mentioned the marker to you last spring. You told me that." "He did. I'd forgotten." "And the woman who runs the trading post on the Maddox Road. Mrs. Cahill. When Corbin moved the marker, it was visible from the trading post approach. She would have noticed." Caleb was quiet for a while, the horses moving steadily on the road between them. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since the night after Corbin came to the ranch," she said. "I've been going over it." "You didn't say." "I wasn't ready to say. I wanted to be sure before I brought it to you." He thought about that. "Most people bring half-formed ideas and expect the other person to finish them." "I know," she said. "I don't like wasting time." He made the sound again that might have been a laugh. She was getting better at identifying it. Jeb Dennett was 19, lean and straightforward, the kind of young man who answered questions directly and found the whole process of being asked to remember things both important and slightly stressful. Evelyn went to the Dennett property while Caleb was working, which she decided afterward had been the right choice, because Jeb Dennett would have been more guarded with Caleb standing there, and was instead reasonably open with a woman he'd never met who was polite, specific, and brought him no reason to be defensive. He remembered the marker. He remembered it clearly because he'd used it as a reference point when he was mapping the Dennett fence line the previous spring and had noted it in his own work record. "Do you still have that record?" Evelyn asked. Jeb thought. "Probably in the barn. Dad keeps everything." "Would you be willing to look for it, and if you find it, speak to an attorney about what you remember?" He looked uncertain. "I don't want trouble with Corbin." "You won't have trouble with Corbin," Evelyn said. "You'll be speaking to a county official about a fact you observed. Corbin doesn't get to decide what a witness remembers." Jeb was quiet for a moment, and then he nodded once, in the way young men do when they've been given a version of something they already knew was right and needed to hear it said plainly. "Mrs. Cahill at the trading post was a different matter. She was a woman in her 60s who had seen most of what the territory had to offer in the way of disputes, schemes, and difficult men, and she had the manner of someone who had come through all of it with her patience mostly intact and her opinions firmly formed. She listened to what Evelyn said. Then she said, "You're Wilder's new wife." "Yes." "You know who Maddox is?" "I know Corbin works for him." Mrs. Cahill looked at her with an assessing expression that was different from the assessing expressions Evelyn had grown up under. This one was looking for something specific. "Maddox has more money than most counties in this territory," she said. "He uses it to make things settle the way he wants." "I know," Evelyn said. "That's why we're documenting everything instead of arguing." Something shifted in Mrs. Cahill's face. "You're the one doing the documenting?" "Yes." "Wilder know that's what he married?" Evelyn looked at her. "I think he's figuring it out." Mrs. Cahill was quiet for a moment, and then she said she did remember the marker. She remembered it specifically because she'd pointed it out to a traveler who'd asked about the creek line in relation to the property boundaries, and she would speak to an attorney about it if needed, though she preferred to give a written statement if that would serve. Evelyn said a written statement would serve very well, and she took out the notebook and wrote down what Mrs. Cahill told her on the spot, and Mrs. Cahill signed it at the bottom with a hand that was entirely steady. She was back at the ranch by late afternoon. Caleb was on the porch when she rode up, and he came to take Peg's reins, and she climbed down and told him what she'd gotten. He stood with the reins in his hand and listened to her go through it. Jeb's record, Mrs. Cahill's statement, the written signature at the bottom of the notebook page. "In one day," he said. "I knew what I was looking for," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face she hadn't seen directed at her before. Something open in a way his face usually wasn't. "Evelyn," he said. "I'll take Peg," she said, reaching for the reins, because she could feel the weight of what he was about to say, and she wasn't sure she was ready to stand still for it in the middle of the yard at the end of a long day. "Let me say this," he said. She stopped. "I don't know how to—" He stopped too. He looked at the reins in his hand. For a man who didn't struggle with silence, he seemed just now to be struggling with it. "I'm not a man who explains himself much. I know that. Claire used to say I communicated better with fence posts than people." The name came out naturally, without the careful quality it sometimes had when he was aware of using it. That meant something, she thought. "What I want to say," he said, "is that I see what you're doing, not just the documents, not just this." He tilted his head toward the notebook. "All of it. From the first week. The work you don't tell me about before you do it. The way you think around a problem instead of through it. The way you—" He stopped again. "You don't wait for someone to hand you a place here. You made one." Evelyn held the notebook against her ribs and looked at him. "I know what I did in that church looked like something," he said. "And I know you've been trying to figure out what it actually was. What I actually—" He pressed his lips together. "I didn't step forward for pity. I want to be clear about that. I stepped forward because standing in that back row watching them laugh at you was the most—" He chose the word carefully. "It was the most wrong thing I'd seen in a long time, and I had the ability to do something about it, so I did." "That's what you told me before," she said. "I know. What I didn't tell you is that when we got in the wagon and you sat there with your hands in your lap and you didn't fall apart—" He paused. "I thought, there is a person worth knowing. I didn't know what that would mean. I still don't, entirely. But I meant it." She stood in the yard in the late afternoon light, and the wind came through the cottonwoods and lifted a strand of hair across her face, and she did not push it away. "You asked me once," he said, "why a respected rancher would choose someone everyone else rejected. You didn't ask me directly. You thought it quietly for about 2 weeks, and I could see you thinking it." She felt color come up in her face. "Could you?" "I watch things," he said. "It's what I do." He looked at her steadily. "The answer is that I didn't choose someone everyone else rejected. I chose you. Whatever they thought about it was their business." Evelyn stood with that. She tried to find the conditional in it, the trap, the correction that would arrive in a moment and reassemble the sentence into something smaller. She couldn't find it. She had been looking for it for 4 weeks, and it was not there. "I don't know how to be chosen," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. "I know," he said. "I can see that too. I might be bad at it for a while. That's all right. I'll probably argue with you. You already do. I'll probably... She stopped. She was listing her flaws preemptively, she realized, the way she always had, the way her family had trained her to do. Get there first. Name them first, so no one could use them against you. She stopped. He was watching her with an expression that was not impatient. You're doing it again, he said quietly. I know, she said. You don't have to. She looked at him. She breathed in and then out. I know, she said again, differently this time. He handed her Peg's reins and went toward the barn, and she stood there a moment longer before following. The confrontation she had not been anticipating came on a Wednesday. She was alone at the ranch. Caleb had gone to the west pasture before dawn and wasn't expected back until late morning, when she heard horses. More than one. She looked out the kitchen window and saw 3 riders coming up the track, and even at that distance, she recognized Corbin's shape in the lead. She took the notebook off the shelf and put it inside the flour tin, where it would take someone 20 minutes to find. Then she went out to the porch and stood there and waited. Corbin pulled up with the 2 men she didn't know flanking him on either side. He looked at her with the same testing quality he'd brought last time, and something added to it now. Something less patient. Need to speak to your husband, he said. He's working, she said. Same answer as before. I'll wait. That could be a while. I'm a patient man. You're actually not, she said. Patient men don't bring company when they come to talk. One of the men on his left shifted his horse slightly. Corbin looked at her with an expression that was moving towards something harder than calculation. Mrs. Wilder, he said, I'm going to be plain with you. The situation with the East Pasture is a business matter between your husband and my employer. I understand you've been involving yourself in it. I'd suggest that's not a wise use of your time. How do you know I've been involving myself? She asked. He paused. A small pause, but she caught it. Small territory, he said. Yes, she said. It is. She was thinking about who had told him. Jeb Dennett wouldn't have. Mrs. Cahill certainly wouldn't, which meant someone at Prescott's office, or someone who'd seen them ride to Mill Haven, or someone in town who connected the timing of their visit with the boundary dispute they'd been watching develop. Tell your employer, she said, that we've filed a documentation request with the county regarding the original boundary markers on this property. Tell him we have witness statements regarding the marker placement prior to last spring. And tell him that the next conversation about the East Pasture will take place in a county office with an attorney present. Corbin looked at her for a moment. Ma'am, he said, and the word had something ugly in it. Your husband built something respectable here. It would be a shame to see a bad decision ruin that. A bad decision, she said, like moving a boundary marker, or like assuming a man is more isolated than he actually is? His jaw tightened. You should go, she said, and I'd recommend not coming back to this property unless it's to schedule that county meeting. She did not know, entirely, where the steadiness was coming from. She could feel her heart loud in her chest, and her hands were not entirely still at her sides. But her voice was, and her face was, and Corbin could not see what was happening underneath those things, and that was sufficient. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled his horse around, said something short and low to the men with him, and rode back down the track. Evelyn stood on the porch until they were through the gate and the dust had settled. Then she sat down in the single porch chair and pressed her hands flat on her knees until they stopped shaking. When Caleb came back 2 hours later, she told him what had happened, all of it, in the same factual order she'd written everything else down. He stood in the kitchen and listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You told him about the county filing, he said. Yes. You told him we have witness statements. Yes. I wanted him to know that waiting us out is no longer the strategy he thinks it is. He came here to rattle us. I wanted him to leave with less certainty than he arrived with. Caleb looked at the flour tin where she'd hidden the notebook. Then he looked at her. Did it work? He said. I think so, she said. He left. He'll go back to Maddox. Good. Maddox is the one who needs to make a decision, not Corbin. Corbin is just the voice. We need to be loud enough that the decision gets pushed upward. He pulled out a chair and sat down at the table, and he rubbed a hand across his face in the way he did when he was tired. Evelyn, he said. I know it's not over, she said quickly. I know Maddox has more resources and more... That's not what I was going to say. She stopped. I was going to say, he said, looking up at her, that you faced down Corbin and two of his men alone on this porch, and you're standing in my kitchen telling me about it, the way you'd tell me about a fence repair, like it was a thing that needed doing and you did it. Yet she didn't say anything. Are you all right? He said. The question landed differently than she expected. Not an assessment, not a qualification, just, are you all right? Directed at her specifically, with the specific quality of a man who wanted to know the actual answer. She thought about it honestly. My hands shook after they left, she said. That's normal. I know. She sat down across from him. I'm all right. I was scared while it was happening, but not in the way that stops you. The other kind. The kind that moves you. Yes. He nodded. He put his hand on the table, not reaching for her, not a gesture of anything except presence. Just his hand on the table between them. She looked at it. She looked at the scar along his jaw that she'd stopped noticing after the first week, and now saw again. She thought about the photograph on the shelf, and the 6 years he'd spent in this house learning how to be alone, and about the woman she'd been 3 weeks ago standing in a church in her grandmother's dress, while the room laughed, and about how much distance there was between that woman and the woman who had just told Corbin to come back with an attorney, or not at all. She didn't think it was Caleb who had made that distance. She didn't think it was him who had changed something in her. She thought it was something she'd always had, something that had been there her entire life, and had simply been surrounded by people who had needed it not to be visible, and what Caleb had done was step back far enough that the light could reach it. He had not made her. He had made room. She understood the difference. She needed to understand it, because the woman who needed making was not who she wanted to be, and the woman who had simply needed room. That was someone she thought she could live inside. She put her hand on the table too, not touching his, just on the table. Present, the way he'd been present in that church when it had been the last thing she expected. Outside, the cottonwoods were moving in the afternoon wind, and the cattle were somewhere in the west pasture where Caleb had left them, and the county would eventually respond to Prescott's filing, and Maddox would have to make a decision that was no longer entirely in his favor. There was more ahead. She knew that. Hard things, uncertain things, the kind that didn't have clean endings. But she was here. In this kitchen, in this life she had not chosen, and was choosing now, with a man who had looked across a room and seen her before she'd had a chance to show him anything, and she was not ashamed and she was not afraid in the way that stopped you. She was only afraid in the kind that moved you forward. That, she was beginning to understand, was enough. The county's response came on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Prescott filed. Caleb brought the letter in from the post at the trading post stop on the Millhaven Road, and he set it on the table without opening it, which told Evelyn something about how much it had cost him to carry it the 2 hours home without knowing what it said. She looked at the envelope and then at him. Do you want to open it, or should I? She said. You, he said. He pulled out a chair and sat down like a man who had been standing too long. She opened it cleanly, the way she did most things, no hesitation once the decision was made. She read it through once to herself first, which she could see tried his patience slightly, and then she read it again to make sure she had it right, and then she set it flat on the table between them. The county has accepted the documentation request, she said. They're ordering a formal survey of the east boundary. Maddox's representative has been notified that the existing marker placement is under dispute and cannot be treated as legally definitive until the survey is complete. Caleb looked at the letter. That means the east pasture water access is effectively unfrozen until the survey settles it, she said. Corbin can't enforce his position on a marker the county has flagged. How long for the survey? 6 to 8 weeks, the letter says. They'll send a surveyor from the territorial office. Caleb put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. She had learned to read his silences well enough by now to know that this one was not the heavy kind. It was the kind that came from relief that a man hasn't entirely let himself anticipate, arriving now and needing a moment to settle. We can move the cattle to the east pasture, she said. Not all of them. Not until the survey confirms. I'd want to be careful about that. But enough to take pressure off the west feed situation. 20 head, he said. Leave the rest west until we know. 20 head, she agreed. He looked up from the table. He looked at her in the direct way he had, the way that still occasionally caught her off guard, because she had spent so many years being looked past rather than at. You did this, he said. We did this, she said. You had the deed. You had the facts. I just organized them into a shape someone official could use. Evelyn. Caleb. He almost smiled. The almost smile had become something she recognized the way you recognize a specific bird call, by its particular quality, brief and real, different from anything performed. All right, he said, we did this. She folded the letter and put it in the notebook, which had migrated from the flower tin to the shelf above the table in the past 2 weeks. Its presence no longer something that needed hiding. The notebook had gotten thicker. She'd added pages, but the Creek Bank sketches, Mrs. Cahill's signed statement, Jeb Dennett's account of the fence line record, and the notation he'd found in his work log from the previous spring, the exchange with Corbin on the porch, written out word for word while it was still fresh. It was a record now of something that had actually happened, a version of events that existed outside of anyone's memory and couldn't be revised. She had always believed in writing things down. She believed it more now. They moved 20 head to the east pasture the following morning. It was not a complicated job with 2 people, but it was a satisfying one. The specific satisfaction of doing something that had been blocked for 8 months, and watching it simply proceed without incident. The cattle moving through the gate, Caleb opened as if they'd always had access to this side, which of course they had, once. They spread out into the east grass and put their heads down and got to work, which was all cattle ever wanted to do, and Evelyn and Caleb sat on the fence rail for a few minutes and watched them. The grass is long, she said. 8 months of long. They'll have it down in 2 weeks. Probably less. He was looking at the creek line where it ran along the eastern edge, the willows green and active along the bank. That's where the second marker should be, he said. You can still see the post hole if you know where to look. Ground's a different color. She looked where he was indicating. She could see it, a slightly darker circle in the earth about 15 feet east of where the new marker stood. Obvious, once you knew. Did you point that out to Prescott? Told him. He said the surveyor will find it. Good. She looked at the marker Corbin had installed. A solid-looking post, well sunk, like something meant to look permanent. Something meant to look like it had always been there. Corbin was thorough, she said. He's not stupid, Caleb said. Just wrong. They came back to the ranch for breakfast, and the morning had the particular quality of a day that had started well and wasn't going to waste it. Caleb worked the barn, and she put the kitchen in order, and then went out to help with the fence on the north side that had needed tightening for a week, and kept being overtaken by more urgent tasks. She was 3 posts in when she heard a horse on the road and looked up. The rider was not Corbin. She did not recognize him initially. He was coming from the direction of town, moving at a pace that was not leisurely, and he pulled up at the gate and called out for Wilder. Working in back, she called. I'll get him. She found Caleb at the barn and said there was someone at the gate, and he came around without hurrying, the way he approached most things, and she saw him recognize the rider when they came into view. That's Calvin, he said. She stopped. Calvin Hartwell was her brother. She had not seen him since the morning of the wedding, when he had appeared briefly near the church wall and looked like a man who wanted very badly to be somewhere else. She had not heard from her family in the 7 weeks since she'd left Red Willow Creek in the wagon. This did not particularly surprise her. It was what she had expected, though expecting a thing and experiencing it were, as always, different in ways that didn't fully reveal themselves until they arrived. Calvin climbed down at the gate and came through looking uncomfortable, which was his default expression, a man permanently slightly behind where he wanted to be. He was 27, 2 years younger than Evelyn, and had their father's build and their mother's talent for being present without being accountable. Evie, he said. Calvin, she said. He looked at Caleb. Mr. Wilder. He extended his hand and Caleb took it, brief and without warmth on either side, the handshake of men who don't know each other and aren't in a hurry to. What brings you out? Evelyn said. Calvin looked at her and then looked away, at the fence line, at the barn, at somewhere that wasn't her face. Mother sent me. I assumed. She wanted to know. He stopped. He pulled his hat off and turned it in his hands, which he had done since he was a boy when he didn't know how to say something. She wanted to know if you were settled, if things were, All right, Evelyn said. Yes. You could have written. She thought it would be better in person. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. She was doing the things she'd learned to do with her family, sorting what was being said from what was actually happening, the two things being rarely identical. What was happening was that her mother had sent Calvin because Ruth Hartwell was not a woman who came herself to anything that might require an apology. And she had sent Calvin specifically because Calvin was too uncomfortable in difficult situations to be effective as an emissary, which meant the information she was looking for could be gathered without any real conversation having to occur. Ruth would learn whether Evelyn was settled and whether Caleb Wilder's ranch was a liability or an asset, and she would adjust her position accordingly, and this entire visit would have cost her nothing. Evelyn knew this the way she knew the shape of every room she'd ever grown up in. "Come in," she said. "I'll put water on." Calvin sat at the kitchen table with the particular stiffness of a man on someone else's territory and looked at the room with eyes that were trying not to look like they were cataloging. Evelyn put water on, and Caleb said he had work to get back to and excused himself, which she appreciated because Calvin was easier without an audience. "You look well," Calvin said. "I am well." "The place looks—" He paused. "You've been working." "Yes." "The fence on the north side, I was working on it when you arrived." She sat down across from him with two cups and waited. Calvin wrapped his hands around his cup and stared into it. He had always been easier with objects than with people, a trait she had in common with him that neither of them had ever acknowledged because it would have required acknowledging they had anything in common. "Thomas Greaves has been talking," he said finally. She had expected this. She said nothing. "He's been telling people in town, at the feed store, wherever men stand around, that Wilder made a mistake, that he took you on as some kind of charity case, and that it'll come out eventually." Calvin looked up briefly and then back at the cup. "He says Wilder was having a bad season before the wedding and that the ranch is on shaky ground." "Thomas Greaves knows nothing about the state of this ranch," Evelyn said. "I'm not saying he does. I'm saying people listen to him. People in Red Willow Creek listen to whoever is talking loudest. That's not new information, Calvin." "Mother's concerned?" "Mother is concerned about what people think," Evelyn said. "That's also not new information." Calvin was quiet for a moment. The water heated on the stove. Outside, she could hear Caleb somewhere near the barn, the regular sound of work being done. "Are you—" Calvin started and stopped. He tried again. "Is it— does he treat you—" "He treats me well," she said. It came out without hesitation, which was itself a thing she noticed. Not defended, not performed, just true. "Better than most people have." Calvin received that without quite meeting her eyes. She watched him absorb the implication of it and file it somewhere he didn't have to look at directly. "I'm glad," he said. He sounded like he meant it, which surprised her slightly. Calvin was not given to meaning things, or at least to showing it. "I didn't—" He pressed his lips together. "At the church. I should have said something." She looked at him. "I didn't know what to say," he said. "That's not an excuse." "I know it isn't, but it's what happened." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She thought about what she wanted to do with this, whether to press it, whether to let it go, whether to find some middle path between the two. She had been doing that calculation her whole life with her family, working out which things were worth the cost of saying and which ones she'd be carrying alone regardless of whether she said them. "I know," she said finally. "I know you didn't know what to say. You never did." She said it without cruelty, just fact. "The thing is, Calvin, neither did I, my whole life. I never knew what to say to any of you, and I tried anyway, and it mostly didn't land. And eventually I stopped trying so hard." She looked at her cup. "What happened at the church? Greaves laughing at me, everyone following. That was Greaves." "I don't hold that against you." She paused. "But you standing at that wall and not moving, that was you. And that I do hold a little. I think I'm allowed." Calvin said nothing. His hat was on the table, and he was looking at it. "I'm not asking you to do anything about it now," she said. "I'm just telling you the truth because you came here, and I'm not interested in performing a version of this conversation that leaves out the actual content." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You sound different." "Do I?" "You never used to say things like that. The actual content." He said it almost to himself. "I know," she said. "I had a lot of practice not saying things." He picked up his hat. He turned it around once in his hands and set it back down. Thomas is planning to be in town next Saturday. Mother wants to know. She didn't say this directly, but I know her. She wants to know if you and Wilder will be coming in for supplies. He stopped. I think she wants to see that things are all right. On her own terms, which are the only terms she operates on. But the underlying thing is real. Evelyn thought about this. Caleb had been talking about the supply run for 2 weeks. They needed feed, nails, several things from the dry goods. It was practical, not optional. We'll be in when we need to be in, she said. Tell her that. Calvin nodded. He finished his water. He stood and picked up his hat and held it at his side. And in the doorway he stopped and looked back at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, or perhaps had not been watching for. I'm glad you didn't just leave that church, he said. That day. I'm glad you stayed where you were. She looked at him. You stood there, he said. While everybody... You just stood there. I've been thinking about it since. He put on his hat. You were always braver than the rest of us. I just didn't know what to do with that. He went out. She heard him speak briefly to Caleb, heard his horse leave the gate at a walk that became a trot on the road. She sat at the table for a moment, and then she got up and went back to the fence on the north side, because it still needed doing, and the morning was not going to wait for her to finish processing what her brother had said. The supply run to Red Willow Creek happened on a Saturday, as it had to. Caleb loaded the wagon before dawn, and they left while the sky was still gray, which put them in town around mid-morning when the main street was starting its day, but not yet at full tide. Evelyn had been in Red Willow Creek exactly once since the wedding, and that had been a quick stop at the trading post on the Millhaven Road, which barely counted as being in town. This was different. This was the main street, the dry goods store, the feed merchant, the people who had been in that church 7 weeks ago and remembered what they'd seen. She knew they would look. She had accepted that before they left the ranch, sitting on the wagon seat in the early dark while Caleb climbed up beside her. She had made the decision then, not performed a decision, actually made one, in the quiet way things settle when you've thought about them long enough, that she was not going to manage their looking. She was going to do what she'd come to do and let people look at whatever they wanted. The first person she recognized on the main street was Mrs. Hart from the dry goods, who was sweeping her porch and stopped sweeping when the wagon came in sight. Evelyn looked at her directly and gave a brief, practical nod. Not warm, not defensive, just the acknowledgement of one person seeing another. Mrs. Hart gave a nod back, slightly delayed, slightly surprised. Caleb pulled up at the dry goods and climbed down and helped her down, and they went in to gather the list she'd made the night before, organized by section of the store the way she organized everything, so they weren't backtracking. Mrs. Hart came back inside and began filling orders with the slightly elevated attention of a woman who was doing 2 things at once, the second being watching everything and preparing to report it accurately. Evelyn didn't mind. She had spent her life being observed by people who thought she didn't notice, and the observation itself didn't trouble her as much as what had once come after it. They were at the counter going through the last items on the list when the door opened and Thomas Greaves walked in. She heard Caleb go still beside her. Not a visible thing, just a quality change in how he was standing, the same way a working dog goes still when it's made a decision but hasn't acted yet. Thomas came to the counter and stopped. He looked at Evelyn first, which she noted. Not at Caleb, at her, the same inventory look he'd given her in the church, though this time without the laugh. Evelyn, he said. Thomas, she said. He looked at Caleb. Wilder. Greaves, Caleb said. Thomas put his own list on the counter and looked at Mrs. Hart, who began finding things to do in another section of the store with great conviction. He looked back at Caleb. Heard you've got a county survey coming on the east boundary. News travels, Caleb said. Maddox isn't happy about it. I expect not. Thomas looked between them, at Caleb, then at Evelyn, then back, with the expression of a man trying to take a reading on something he hasn't fully understood. You filed it, he said, not quite a question. He was looking at Evelyn. We filed it, she said. Heard you went to Millhaven, saw Prescott. He said this like it was mildly impressive, and he wasn't sure he wanted to be impressed. Heard you brought statements. From people who remembered the original marker position, she said. Yes. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face that she read eventually, as a man revising a previous assessment, which was not the same as the assessment being wrong. and he probably knew the difference. He knew what he had decided in that church, and he was not a man who walked back things easily, but he was apparently also not entirely comfortable with what the 7 weeks since had demonstrated. "You've settled in then," he said, trying for casual and landing just short of it. "Yes," she said. "The ranch is ours to manage," she said. Not hard, not cold, just clear. He picked up his list. He said something to Mrs. Hart when she reappeared. He did not leave the store, but he moved to the other end of the counter, and Evelyn turned back to her own list and finished accounting for the order without looking at him again. Outside loading the wagon, Caleb said, "You handled that." "There wasn't much to handle," she said. "He's smaller than I remembered." Caleb looked at her. "He was never actually—" "I know," she said. "That's what I mean." She handed him a wrapped bundle from the back of the wagon to redistribute the weight, and they worked through the loading in the practiced way they did things now, without having to discuss the method, each of them knowing what needed doing. It was Doyle who started it. Doyle, who had been grinning from the front pew 7 weeks ago, who had stood beside Thomas and found the whole thing funny. He was coming out of the feed store with 2 other men when he saw Caleb at the wagon and said something, not quietly, with the particular confidence of a man in a group who has calculated that the audience is with him. "Wilder, heard you're spending money on lawyers now. That's a new development for a man who couldn't keep his east pasture fed." Caleb did not stop what he was doing. He finished tying the rope on the wagon and straightened. "Funny thing about that," he said. "The east pasture's running 20 head as of this week." Doyle's expression shifted slightly. "Survey's not back." "Survey doesn't have to be back for us to use our own land." He said it without raising his voice. "The county flagged the marker placement. The marker's disputed. Our deed is not." "Maddox will have something to say about that." "Maddox is welcome to say it in a county office with both our attorneys present." Caleb picked up the next item for the wagon. "That's what we've arranged for." Doyle was recalibrating. He looked at Evelyn, the same look he'd used in the church pew, the one that was meant to locate her as the weak point. "Your wife's idea, was it?" "It was both of ours," Caleb said. His voice had not changed in pitch or volume. "She did the documentation. I provided the facts and the deed. Between the 2 of us, we had everything Prescott needed." "Must be nice," Doyle said. And there was something in it, something that was trying to be a joke and was covering something less comfortable than a joke. Having a wife who takes over the paperwork. "She doesn't take it over," Caleb said. "She's better at it than I am. That's not taking over, that's a partnership. You might try it sometime." One of the men with Doyle made a short sound that might have been a laugh, not at Caleb, at Doyle. Doyle looked at Evelyn again. She met his look without moving, without helping him with it. He had nothing to do with whatever he found in her face that wasn't what he'd expected, and after a moment he looked away first. They left. Evelyn watched them go and then turned back to the wagon. "You didn't have to say that," she said. "I know," Caleb said. "I could have answered him." "I know that too." He looked at her. "I wanted to say it. Not for you. You don't need me to say it for you. I wanted to say it because it's true, and I wanted to be the one to say it in public." He paused. "Is that all right?" She thought about this. She thought about the difference between being defended and being seen, and whether those 2 things could coexist without one swallowing the other. "Yes," she said. "That's all right." They finished loading and Caleb went to settle the account at the feed merchant, and Evelyn stood at the wagon for a moment in the main street of Red Willow Creek, in the morning light, with the sound of the town doing what it did around her. She was aware of people. She was always aware of people. That had been trained into her by years of needing to know the temperature of a room before she walked further into it. Mrs. Hart was visible through the dry goods window. A woman named Patterson, who had been 3 rows back in the church, was crossing the street with a basket and met Evelyn's eyes and then looked away. A look that wasn't hostile exactly, more like uncertain, like she was trying to reconcile 2 things she'd seen and hadn't finished the reconciliation. Evelyn did not perform anything for these people. She did not stand straight to make a point, or look around to see who was watching, or arrange her face into any particular expression. She simply stood at the wagon in the morning light and thought about the feed situation on the east pasture and whether they had ordered enough nails. And if people were watching, they were watching a woman who had somewhere to be and people to go back to and work that needed doing. That was enough. That was, she thought, exactly enough. Well, Her mother found her at the wagon. Ruth Hartwell appeared from the direction of the milliners, which Evelyn suspected was not where she'd actually been, but where she'd positioned herself to appear to be coming from, which was how her mother moved through any situation she wanted to control. She was a neat, composed woman who had maintained her composure through 30 years of a difficult marriage, and a life that had not gone precisely as she'd arranged, and had emerged from all of it upright, which Evelyn had inherited without being given credit for. "Evelyn," her mother said. "Mother." Ruth looked at the wagon, the supplies, the loaded bed. She looked at Evelyn's hands, which were rough and bore the scar from the pliers accident that had healed clean but was still visible. She looked at Evelyn's face with the particular searching quality of a woman who wants information but does not want to ask for it. "You look healthy," Ruth said. "I am," Evelyn said. "Calvin said the ranch is coming along." She said it neutrally, not closing the door but not opening it wide either. Ruth was quiet for a moment. They stood beside the wagon in the street, and the gap between them had, as always, the quality of something that could be crossed or not crossed, and the choice was always presented as Evelyn's to make, the implication being that Ruth was simply standing where she'd always been. "Thomas Greaves is going to marry the Holt girl," Ruth said. "I thought you should know." "That's good for the Holt girl," Evelyn said. "Or it isn't. I don't know her well enough to say." Ruth looked at her. "You're not—" She paused. "You're not upset?" "About Thomas Greaves?" Evelyn looked at her mother. "No, Mother, I'm not upset about Thomas Greaves. I only thought—" Ruth stopped. She straightened slightly, the habitual posture adjustment of a woman reassembling herself. "I made a mistake," she said. Not easily. The words cost her something. Evelyn could see the cost of them, though she could also see that Ruth had prepared them, had possibly rehearsed them. "The arrangement I made with Greaves, I made it quickly, and I should have—" She stopped again. "I thought I was being practical." "You were being practical," Evelyn said. "You were being practical about me, the way you always were. Practical means you weren't considering what I wanted. But you were solving a problem you'd decided I was." Ruth's jaw tightened slightly, and then released. "Yes," she said. "That's—" She didn't complete it. Evelyn looked at her mother, at the composure and the effort behind the composure, at the woman who had made her and had not known quite what to do with what she'd made. She felt, looking at her, a complicated thing that was not forgiveness exactly, and not bitterness exactly, something that occupied the territory between those two things and didn't have a simple name. "I'm not going to tell you it doesn't matter," Evelyn said. "It does. You know it does." She paused. "But I'm also not going to stand here in the street and have the fight we never had, because that's not what I came to town for." Ruth looked at her for a moment. Something in her face shifted. Not quite breaking, nothing so dramatic, but something releasing that had been held a long time. "Are you happy?" Ruth asked. The question came out differently than anything that had preceded it. Plain, without strategy, just the question itself. Evelyn thought about the ranch and the notebook and the 20 cattle on the east pasture, and Caleb at the table reading the county letter, and the morning with the rain and the flour tin, and the conversation in the kitchen, the night she hadn't been able to sleep, and the photograph on the shelf, and the porch chair in the evening light. "I'm getting there," she said. "That's more than I expected to be able to say." Ruth nodded, once. She looked like she understood more in that answer than Evelyn had intended to put in it, and for once that felt like less of a liability. Caleb came back from the feed merchant and stopped when he saw Ruth, and Evelyn said, "Caleb, this is my mother," without any architecture around it, just the simple statement of who people were. Caleb said, "Mrs. Hartwell," and Ruth said, "Mr. Wilder." And they shook hands with the particular care of two people who have each heard things about the other and are in the early stages of deciding what to make of the actual person. "You have a strong ranch," Ruth said. She said it with authority, like she'd already decided and was presenting a verdict. "We do," Caleb said. He glanced at Evelyn. "We're working on it." Ruth looked between them, a look that Evelyn recognized as her mother taking inventory, the things she could not help doing, adding things up. She seemed to find what she was looking for in whatever she added up, because the quality of her expression changed again, slightly, in the direction of something close to relief. "I should get on," Ruth said. She looked at Evelyn. "Perhaps you'll come for supper sometime, when you can get away?" "Perhaps," Evelyn said. Ruth left. Evelyn watched her go and felt the specific sensation of a chapter not ending exactly, but pausing. A thing that had been open for 24 years not closing, but no longer bleeding the way it had. Your mother, Caleb said. Yes. She's exactly what you'd expect, Evelyn said, but not entirely. She turned back to the wagon. She made an effort. She doesn't do that often. I'll give her the effort. He nodded. He climbed up to the wagon seat and she came around and climbed up herself before he could offer, and they sat side by side on the seat in the Saturday morning light of Red Willow Creek. Ready? He said. Yes, she said. Then, Caleb. What you said to Doyle. She looked at the street ahead. Partnership. You said it like you meant it. I did mean it. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the steady, direct look that had once surprised her, and now felt as familiar as the porch chair and the sound of the wood stove and the particular creak of the barn door that needed a new hinge and kept not getting one. I know, she said. That's what I wanted to say. That I know. He clicked his tongue at the horse. The wagon moved. Red Willow Creek shifted and receded behind them, with its people and its whispers and its opinions, and the church at the end of the main street that had been the site of something that looked like an ending and had turned out to be the beginning of something neither of them had planned. The road opened up ahead of them, pale and unhurried in the late morning light. She did not look back. The surveyor arrived on a Tuesday in late May, which was 6 weeks after the county letter and 2 weeks later than the estimate Prescott had given them, because the territorial office moved at its own pace regardless of what anyone's letter said. His name was Alderman. He was a compact, weathered man in his 50s who carried his equipment with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this work long enough that the process was entirely automatic, and who had, Evelyn noted, the particular quality of a person who had seen enough disputes over land to have stopped taking sides in any of them. He was interested only in what the ground said. That, she thought, was exactly what they needed. Caleb met him at the gate and brought him to the east boundary, and Evelyn came along because she had the notebook and because she had been part of building this case from the beginning and was not going to wait at the house while the most important part of it happened. Alderman did not comment on her presence. He set up his equipment and began working the line from the west, methodically, reading the land the way a man reads a document he's been asked to verify. It took most of the morning. Evelyn stood with Caleb at the fence rail and watched and did not speak, because there was nothing useful to say, and because Alderman was the kind of man who did better without people talking at him while he worked. The cattle on the east pasture moved around behind them with their usual indifference to human concerns. The creek ran along the eastern edge with the particular sound it made in late spring, fuller than it would be by August, purposeful. At one point, Alderman stopped and crouched near the ground, at a spot that Evelyn recognized, the slightly darker circle of earth, the old post hole she'd seen from the fence rail 2 months ago. He looked at it for a long time. He took measurements. He wrote things in his own book. He moved to where Corbin's marker stood, 15 feet to the west, and took measurements there too. He did not say anything until he was done, and when he was done, he came back to where they were waiting and looked at his notes and said, "The original post hole is consistent with the deed boundary as written. The current marker is 15 feet 4 inches outside the legal boundary line, in the direction of the Maddox property." Caleb said nothing. Evelyn said, "Can you put that in writing for the county?" "That's what I'm here for," Alderman said, without inflection. He was already closing his book. She looked at Caleb. He was looking at the current marker, at the solid, well-sunk post that Corbin had put in the ground last spring with the assumption that a man alone and cash poor would not have the resources to contest it. There was something in Caleb's face that she didn't try to read too closely, because it was private, the expression of a man who had been carrying something for 8 months and was feeling the weight of it shift. "Thank you," he said to Alderman. "I'll file the report by end of week," Alderman said. He packed his equipment, shook hands with Caleb briefly, gave Evelyn a nod that contained a kind of professional acknowledgement she appreciated, and went back to his horse. They stood at the east fence for a moment after he'd gone, just the two of them, and the cattle and the creek. 8 months, Caleb said. "It's done now," she said. "Not quite." "No, but the part that was uncertain is done." She looked at the old post hole, still visible, still telling the truth about where the line had always been. "Corbin moved a marker. He did it because he thought you were alone and couldn't fight it. He was wrong on the second part." Caleb turned to look at her. He was wrong on the first part too, he said, as it turned out. She held that for a moment. Then she picked up the notebook and they walked back to the ranch. And the morning opened up around them into all the ordinary work that needed doing, which was, she had come to understand, its own kind of abundance. Prescott sent word 2 weeks later. The county had accepted Alderman's report. The boundary was restored to its original deed position. Maddox's representative, not Corbin. This time, an actual attorney from the territorial capital had filed a brief objection that Prescott described in his letter as, in his professional opinion, an attempt to delay rather than a genuine legal argument, and the county had rejected it in language that suggested they were familiar with this kind of attempt. The letter also noted that the county was opening a secondary inquiry into whether the marker displacement had been deliberate, which was a different category of matter than a boundary dispute and carried different implications. Prescott recommended they cooperate fully with the inquiry and let the process run. Evelyn read the letter twice, added it to the notebook, and went to find Caleb in the barn. He was mending a harness, the same one he'd been working on, in pieces, for the past month. He looked up when she came in. "It's done," she said. He set the harness down. She handed him the letter and he read it, and when he was finished he folded it carefully, with more care than he usually gave to paper, and handed it back. "The secondary inquiry," he said. "Yes. That could get complicated." "For Maddox," she said, not for us. We have the documentation. We cooperate, we answer honestly, we let Prescott handle the filings. The complicated part is theirs." He looked at her. "You're not worried?" "I'm always a little worried," she said. "I just don't let it make decisions for me." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'm going to move the rest of the cattle to the east pasture. The full 43? Split them. 25 east, 18 west. Rotate them through the season." He looked at the barn wall, the way he looked at things he was planning. "By fall, if the feed holds, we can think about adding stock. How many?" "Another 10, maybe 15. See how the land responds first." She nodded. She was already doing the math, feed costs against projected weight gain, against market prices. The same arithmetic she'd been running quietly in the background for months, keeping it ready for when it was needed. "That puts us in a different position by spring," she said. "A better one." Significantly. She paused. "You'll need another hand for the fall if the herd goes to 55. "I know." "Jeb Dennett's been asking around about work." Caleb looked at her. "Has he?" "He mentioned it to me when I went to give him the county update. He's loyal, he knows the land, and he already knows our situation." She paused. "He also helped us win the boundary case, which suggests his judgment is sound." Caleb thought about this for a moment. "Talk to him," he said. "I will." He picked the harness back up. She stood in the barn doorway with the letter in her hand and the spring light coming in at the angle it did in late afternoon, and she felt, not triumph, which was a feeling she'd always been suspicious of, too clean and too brief, but something more durable than triumph, something that had weight to it and would still be there tomorrow. The Saturday they went back to Red Willow Creek in June was not planned as anything significant. They needed supplies, as they always needed supplies, and the timing aligned with a meeting Caleb had arranged with Prescott to review the secondary inquiry paperwork. It was a practical trip, not a statement. And yet Evelyn found herself, on the wagon seat heading into town, aware of something different in the quality of the morning. She couldn't have said precisely what it was. The same road, the same horse, the same man beside her. But something had settled in her over the past weeks. Not arrived suddenly, not the product of any single conversation or event, but accumulated the way all real things accumulated, layered quietly until there was enough of it to stand on. She had been thinking, in the days before this trip, about the woman who had walked into that church 10 weeks ago, about the burned eggs in the grandmother's dress, and the particular quality of being surrounded by people who had made a decision about her before she'd finished arriving. She could see that woman clearly. She had not gone anywhere. She was still entirely herself, still inside Evelyn's body and memory, and the way she sometimes still flinched when she was about to say something, and had to remind herself that this was not a room where flinching was required. But she could also see what that woman had not been able to see then, that she had been standing in the wrong room her whole life. Not defective, not wrong. In the wrong room, among people who had needed her to be smaller than she was for reasons that were entirely about them. The church in Red Willow Creek had been the last of those rooms. She had walked out of it into a wagon and down a road and into a life that had not been arranged to require her smallness. That was the thing. It was a simple thing, when you got to the bottom of it. She was thinking about this when they came into town, and she noticed immediately that there were more people on the main street than was usual for a Saturday morning. Not a crowd exactly, but a gathering quality to it, people moving toward the same general area. She followed the movement with her eyes and located its center near the open ground beside the feed store where, on certain Saturdays in summer, there was sometimes music. A fiddle player named Garrett who set up on the far side of the street and played for whoever stopped, and sometimes people danced, and sometimes people just stood and listened. And it was one of the few things about Red Willow Creek that had no agenda attached to it. Garrett was there now, with his fiddle, playing something that was quick and a little ragged in the best way. The way good fiddle music always was, alive and imperfect. Caleb pulled the wagon up at the dry goods and they climbed down and went about their list. And Evelyn did not think about the music beyond registering that it was there. She had things to do. They were at the feed merchant when she ran into Mrs. Hart, who had come around from the dry goods for reasons that were probably not entirely about feed, and who said, with the air of a woman delivering a verdict she'd arrived at after careful deliberation, "You look well, Evelyn, better than I've seen you." "I am well," Evelyn said. "The ranch is working out." "It is." Mrs. Hart looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has revised her position on something and is in the process of making the revision official. "I said something at the church," she said. "The morning of—" "I was whispering to Margaret Patterson. I don't know if you heard." "I wasn't paying attention to any one voice," Evelyn said honestly. "Still," Mrs. Hart pressed her lips together briefly, "it wasn't necessary." Evelyn looked at her, at the effort of it, the small cost that this kind of statement always extracted from people who were not accustomed to paying it. She thought about what to do with the effort. She could receive it coolly, which would be accurate to what she felt but not particularly useful. She could receive it warmly, which would be more generous than she actually had access to at this moment. "I appreciate you saying so," she said, which was true. It was, actually, true, and that was sufficient. Mrs. Hart nodded with the relief of someone who'd delivered something difficult and found it accepted. The meeting with Prescott took an hour. He went through the secondary inquiry documents with the same rapid-fire repetition habit that Evelyn had come to find, if not endearing, at least predictable, and outlined what Maddox's attorney had filed and what the county was likely to do with it. The picture was not simple, but it was not alarming. Maddox had resources and would use them to slow the process, but the foundation of the case, Alderman's survey, the witness statements, the documented post hole, was solid enough that delay was Maddox's best available strategy rather than a genuine legal challenge. "How long does delay take?" Caleb asked. 6 months, perhaps. Perhaps more. More? Prescott wrote something. "Maddox will be weighing whether the cost of the fight is worth the land he stands to lose access to. At some point, most men in his position decide their resources are better spent elsewhere. And if he doesn't decide that? Then we continue to document, respond methodically, and let the county process run. Process run." Prescott looked up. "Mr. Wilder, you have an excellent case. I don't say that to all my clients." "You say it to enough of them," Caleb said. "Only when it's true." Outside Prescott's office, Caleb looked at her. "Well?" "He's right," she said. "We have an excellent case. We wait, we document, we don't panic." She looked down the street toward the sound of Garrett's fiddle, which had been going this whole time, carried on the warm June air. "There's nothing more to do today. We've still got the supply run." "I know, but after." He looked at her. "After what?" She didn't answer immediately. She started walking in the direction of the music, and he fell into step beside her because that was what he did. He read the direction of things and adjusted without making a speech about it, which was one of the things she had come to rely on in him without fully articulating until now. The gathering near the feed store had grown. There were maybe 30 people clustered on the open ground and the edge of the street, listening, watching the two couples who had started dancing in the cleared space. Garrett was playing well today, something that moved, And the people who were dancing were not graceful exactly, but they were committed, and there was a warmth in the gathered crowd that Red Willow Creek did not always produce but was capable of. On days like this, when the air was good and the music was right. Evelyn stopped at the edge of the crowd. She did not entirely know what she was doing here. She had not planned this stop. She had simply walked toward the music because something in her had wanted to, and now she was here, and she was aware of people around her beginning to notice her and Caleb, the way people notice things in small towns. Not all at once, but sequentially, one person's attention catching another's until the awareness spread through the crowd like a slow ripple. She recognized some faces. The Patterson woman. Doyle, standing at the far edge with his arms crossed, not looking at her, but not looking at her. A few people from the church pews who had been various degrees of complicit in that morning, and who now wore various degrees of the particular expression of people who are reassessing something they did. Thomas Greaves was there. She saw him standing with a young woman she didn't know. The Holt girl, probably. And he looked up and saw her, and something moved across his face quickly, and then was gone. She stood at the edge of this crowd and felt very clearly the choice in front of her. She could stay at the edge. She had spent her whole life at the edge of rooms, the place where you were technically present but not committed, where the exit was always close and the damage was therefore always limited. The edge was where she had lived, and she knew every inch of it, and it was safe in the specific way that safe things are safe, entirely, and at a cost. Or she could step in. She felt Caleb beside her, not touching her, not prompting her, just there. "Caleb," she said. "Do you dance?" A pause. "Poorly," he said. "How poorly?" "I've been told I have the rhythm of a man counting fence posts." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the steady, direct look, and somewhere in it was the thing she had come to know as his version of warmth. Not performed, not announced, just present, like heat from a stove you've stopped noticing because it's always there. "Do you want to?" she asked. He looked at the dancing space, at the crowd, at all the people who had opinions and would form more. She watched him consider it with the same practical honesty he brought to everything. "Yes," he said. "If you do." She took a breath. Not a theatrical one, just the kind you take when you're about to do something that costs something, and you've decided the cost is worth it. She took his hand. His hand was dry and rough and familiar, the hand of a man who worked with it, and it held hers with a grip that was firm without being tight, the way he'd offered his arm in the church, neither a claim nor a performance, just present. Here, solid. They stepped into the cleared space. She was not a good dancer. She had never been taught properly, had only ever moved to music in private, in the kitchen or her room, never watched, never exposed to the assessment of other people. Her feet did not know what to do with the fiddle's tempo, and her first steps were tentative and slightly wrong. Caleb was, as advertised, not good either. He moved with a focused effort that had more determination than grace, his brow slightly furrowed the way it was when he was concentrating on something practical. They were both, in other words, entirely imperfect. And something about that, about the two of them in this dusty open space in front of 30 people who had opinions, both of them moving wrong and neither of them stopping, was the most honest thing she had done in a long time, maybe in her life. She felt the crowd around them. She felt the looking, the quiet that had settled over the gathering as people registered what they were seeing. She felt Thomas Greaves somewhere in her peripheral vision, and Doyle's crossed arms, and Mrs. Hart, and the Patterson woman, and all the rest of them with their whispers, and their assessments, and their long memories for what a person had been at their lowest moment. She felt all of it, and she kept moving. Garrett shifted into something slower, whether by coincidence or design she couldn't have said, and the new tempo was easier to manage, and she found herself settling into it, finding the shape of it, her feet making fewer errors. Caleb found it too. She felt him find it, the slight easing of the focused effort into something more natural, not graceful, but real. She looked up at him. He was looking at her already. "You're doing it," he said quietly. "We're both doing it," she said. "I mean," he paused, and she understood that he meant something larger than the dancing, and she understood that she knew what he meant, and that understanding moved through her like something coming loose that had been held too long. "I know," she said. They moved through the rest of the song in the imperfect, determined way they'd started. And when it ended, they stopped, and the crowd around them did something she had not expected. Some of them clapped. Not all of them. Not a standing ovation, not a performance. Just a handful of people, scattered through the gathering, who put their hands together for a moment, and the sound of it was quiet and genuine, the kind of applause that doesn't know it's making a statement, but is. Mrs. Hart was one of them, the Patterson woman. Jeb Dennett, who she hadn't realized was in the crowd, standing near the back, nodded once when she caught his eye. She turned away from the crowd and looked at Caleb, and she was not performing anything, not managing anyone's perception, not arranging her face into an expression she thought was expected. She was just a woman who had danced badly in the main street of the town that had laughed at her, and she was still upright, and the laughing had not come. What had come, instead, was something quieter. The particular quiet of a room that has revised itself. She did not need the revision. She understood that now, standing in the June air with Garrett's fiddle picking up again behind her, she did not need these people to change their minds about her. She had stopped needing that somewhere in the past weeks without quite noticing the moment it happened. The way you stop noticing a pain that has gradually eased. What she had instead was better. She had stopped caring what they needed to be true about her. She had simply become what she was, in the place she was, with the person she had chosen and who had chosen her, and the town's opinion of that was the town's business. That was the difference. That was the whole of it. Thomas Greaves stopped them as they were heading back to the wagon. She saw him coming and did not slow her pace, which meant he had to adjust to fall into step beside her for a moment, which gave her a small private satisfaction she did not show on her face. "Wilder," he said. Then, after a pause, "Evelyn." "Thomas," she said. He looked between them. He had the expression of a man composing something that had gone through several drafts. "I heard about the boundary matter," he said. "The survey coming out in your favor." "The survey came out in accordance with the deed," Caleb said, "which is what surveys do." Thomas absorbed this. "I wanted to say—" He stopped. He tried again. "What I did in the church. I want you to know I'm not—" He seemed to find the end of the sentence difficult to locate. "Proud of it?" Evelyn said, not helping him with it. "No," he said, simply. "No additional architecture." She looked at him. She had thought about this moment, not often, but sometimes, in the way you think about something you expect to come around eventually. She had thought about what she would say, what she might want to say, the various versions of it. She had imagined being cutting, being cold, being magnanimous in a way that made her point more sharply than anger would. Standing here, she found that none of those versions fit exactly. "You did what you did because you could," she said, "because the room let you. That's not nothing. That's a real thing you did. I'm not going to tell you it doesn't matter." She held his look. "But I'm also not going to spend time on it anymore. I have a ranch to get back to." Thomas looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, once, with the expression of a man who has received something honest and knows it. She walked on. Caleb walked beside her. "That was generous," he said when Thomas was behind them. "It wasn't generous," she said. "It was efficient. I don't want to carry it." She paused. "There's a difference." "I know there is," he said. "Still." She let that sit without arguing it further, because he was not entirely wrong. On the wagon home, the road was gold. In the late afternoon light, the way roads in this territory got in June, the dust catching the low sun and making everything look like something that would be worth remembering. Evelyn sat on the seat with her hands loose in her lap, not folded, not pressed flat the way they used to be when she was bracing against something. Just there. She thought about the notebook, which was at the ranch on the shelf above the kitchen table, which was where it lived now. Not hidden in the flour tin, not carried as armor, just there. A record of things that had happened and been dealt with and added to the sum of what they were building. She thought about the east pasture with the cattle moving through the long grass, and the second willow marker that Alderman's report had restored to its correct position in the county record, and the old post hole in the earth that had kept telling the truth regardless of what anyone put in the ground beside it. She thought that land was like that. It remembered. It kept the record of what had actually been underneath whatever was imposed on it, and given enough time and the right instrument, the truth came back to the surface. She thought this was also, maybe, true of people. She had spent 24 years having things imposed on her. The verdict of her family, the verdict of this town. The assessment of a man at an altar who had looked at her and laughed because the room had let him. She had absorbed those verdicts the way ground absorbs what's pressed into it, and they had gone deep, and she had believed them with the specific thoroughness of someone who has been told the same thing enough times that it stops feeling like an opinion and starts feeling like a fact. But underneath all of it, all that time, there had been the original, the actual record. The woman who had eaten burned eggs alone in the early morning because she didn't waste food, who had kept her father's account since she was 14, who had restrung the chicken pen wire with a broken tool and a cut thumb and kept going, who had documented a boundary dispute into a successful county survey and faced a man like Corbin on her porch alone and told him to come back with an attorney, who had walked into a clearing in the main street of the town that had laughed at her and danced, badly, in front of all of them, and had not stopped. That woman had always been there. She had not been made by Caleb, or by the ranch, or by any external circumstance. She had been there the whole time, waiting for a room that didn't require her to be less than she was. She was done waiting. She turned to look at Caleb, who was driving with the easy looseness of a man on familiar road heading home, and she thought about what home had meant to her a year ago, a word attached to a house where she'd been permanent and invisible, a place she'd known every corner of and felt no claim to. And what it meant now, a low, wide building going silver gray at the timber, a shelf with 6 books and a notebook, a kitchen table where 2 people sat and solved things, a porch with 1 chair that was always available, a barn with a door that needed a hinge, cattle on the east pasture that were finally where they were supposed to be. Not perfect. Not finished. Not the version of a life that anyone would have written for her if they'd been given the assignment. Hers. Caleb, she said. She considered what she wanted to say, and found, after a moment, that the whole of it was too large for a sentence, and the sentence she had was sufficient anyway. I'm glad you were at the back of that church, she said. He was quiet for a moment, the horse moving steadily on the road. So am I, he said. That was all. They drove the rest of the way in the comfortable quiet that was, she had learned, its own language. Not the silence of things unsaid, but the silence of 2 people who have said enough and know it, who have built a sufficiency between them that doesn't require constant maintenance. They got home in the early evening, with the light going amber and long across the ranch, the shadows of the cottonwoods stretching east across the creek. Evelyn climbed down from the wagon and stood for a moment while Caleb unhitched the horse, and she looked at the place the way she sometimes did, deliberately, taking it in as a whole rather than a list of tasks. The fence on the north side was properly tensioned now, had been for weeks. The south chicken pen wire was solid. The barn door still needed the hinge, a fact she had entered into the notebook under the heading of things to address before winter, along with the east room plaster and the section of porch rail that had a split developing near the post. The list was not short, but it was a list of things that would be addressed, not a list of things being ignored because the hands weren't there, or the resources weren't there, or the will had been leached out by 8 months of enforced passivity. Jeb Dennett was starting in September. She had arranged it yesterday before the supply run, a brief conversation at the Dennett property that had resulted in a handshake agreement and a start date, and Jeb had looked relieved in the way young men look when they've been hoping for a particular thing and were not sure they'd get it. The herd was 43 now. By spring, with careful management, it would be 55. The feed situation that had been critical in February was stable and trending better. The county boundary matter was resolved in their favor, and the secondary inquiry, while ongoing, was in Prescott's capable if repetitive hands. None of this had happened because someone arrived and rescued them. That was the thing she found herself wanting to say, not to anyone in particular, not as a statement to make at anyone, just as a thing she understood that she had not understood before. She had been raised to believe that rescue was the shape a good outcome took, a man who would see past her plainness and choose her anyway, a circumstance that would step in and reverse the verdict of all the other circumstances. She had arrived at that church believing, despite everything, against all the evidence of her own nature, that what she needed was someone to decide she was worth it. What she had found, instead, was something both simpler and harder, a man who had stepped aside enough to let her be what she was, and a life that required her actual self rather than a managed version of it, and the discovery that the self underneath the management was more capable than anyone, including herself, had given it credit for. That was what she wanted to say. Not as a lesson, because she was suspicious of lessons that arrived too cleanly, just as the truth of what had happened to her, in this place, in these months, with this imperfect, quietly decent man who communicated better with fence posts than people, and had loved a woman named Clara and carried that loss with a steadiness that had eventually made room for something new. People talked about love as though it arrived all at once, a single event, a door opening. She was not sure that was how it worked. She was fairly sure that was not how it had worked for her. What had happened, instead, was a series of small and ordinary moments. A cup of water, a wound cleaned, a hand extended across a table, a sentence said plainly in a barn, they were wrong. These things had accumulated until the accumulation was itself something, something with weight and continuity, something she would carry differently than she carried everything else because it had not been imposed on her or managed around her or negotiated in her absence. It had grown between two people who had each, in their different ways, learned to live with less, and who had found in each other a sufficiency that neither had expected. That was love, she thought. Not the arrival, but the accumulation. Not the door opening, but the steady daily choosing to go through it. She went inside and put water on, the same as every evening. Caleb came in from the barn 20 minutes later, boots scraped, hands washed at the porch basin. He came through the door and stopped when he saw her at the stove, and she looked at him and he looked at her, and something passed between them that neither of them named because it didn't need a name. It had a shape already, in the specific quality of the room, in the way the evening came through the window and fell across the floor between them, in the years that lay ahead, unwritten, available, waiting for whatever they brought to them. Supper's about an hour, she said. I'll fix the barn door hinge, he said. It's on the list, she said. Before winter. I know, I'll do it now anyway. She looked at him. He almost smiled. The small, real one, the one that wasn't performed. She turned back to the stove. He went back out. She heard the barn door, the familiar creak of it, and then the sound of work starting. The methodical, unhurried sound of a man fixing something because it needed fixing, and he was there to fix it. Outside, the cottonwoods were settling into the evening quiet, the creek moving through the long grass of the east pasture where 43 cattle stood in the last light. The notebook sat on the shelf above the table, its pages thick with what had been documented and survived. The 6 books stood beside it, spines out. The photograph of Clara and Thomas sat on the shelf by the wood stove, in the light, where it had always been. This was not a perfect life. She did not want a perfect life, had stopped wanting one sometime in the past months without noticing the precise moment of departure. The way you stop wanting a thing when you found what you actually needed was different. This was a true life, a life that required her full and actual self, a life she had not been handed but had moved toward, step by practical step, across documents and arguments and bad writing and chicken wire and a dance that neither of them did gracefully. Hers, chosen, real. Outside, the barn door swung, and this time it swung clean, no creak, the hinge set right at last, the small and ordinary sound of something fixed that had been waiting to be fixed. Evelyn heard it from the kitchen and smiled, not at anyone, just at the room, at the evening, at the fact of it. Then she turned back to the stove and got on with supper, and the ranch held the two of them in its plain and weathered quiet, and the light went slowly out of the sky, and the day ended the way good days end, without announcement, without ceremony, settling into night as naturally as breath.